Let's pretend there are two buttons. If you press, say, the red button, 400 billion people die. However, if you press the green button, 100 billion people die. But that's less people, right? Not that the guilt will be any less crushing. And no, you can't choose not to push either button, because this is why you were born, to make a sacrificial choice 1,000 years in the making. You will carry this unthinkable trauma and pain so that the rest of us can live unburdened. And aren't you so glad that you're the chosen one? We need context. Okay, every planet in Frank Herbert's Dune, every nation, every army, every individual is dependent on a ritual wherein someone drowns a god in a bathtub. And if that sounds insane, you've actually heard this story many times before, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. In Dune, the gods are worms, at least to the people of Arrakis, as that planet's entire ecosystem hinges on the almighty sandworm species. And for the rest of the galaxy, well, sandworms produce the spice, a substance absolutely critical to space travel, economics, politics, so really these worms are of divine importance to everyone. But what's perhaps most significant is the sandworm's ability to make the water of life, a mind-expanding elixir with the potential to reshape the galaxy's very future. And there's an easy way to get it. You take a baby sandworm, the holy child of the most sacred being, and you drown it. Sacrificing a god to obtain resources with the same impartiality that one might harvest wheat might sound like an unconventional plot point. Yet in his study, The Golden Bough, author James Frazer argues divine sacrifice is among the most universal cultural touchstones, foundational to how we perceive the world. Frazer points to harvest deities present across civilizations, beings who must typically die each winter in order for the world to bloom again come spring. He singles out the death of the Barley King, a pagan European figure who is ritualistically cut by the knee, crushed between stones, the marrow of his bones burned, the crowd then drinking of his very heart's blood. The Barley King, or John Barleycorn, is actually a personification of processing grain, the blood of his heart simply beer. But it's a striking concept, a community sustaining themselves, sustaining the world, on the flesh of a suffering deity. To be chosen is to be consumed. And though preordained sacrifice is the lifeblood that pumps the heart of the Dune universe, the sandworm is not the only divine child on the altar. Lead character Paul Atreides is the product of a centuries-long breeding program to bring about a prophesied figure, a being who can foresee all possible futures and therefore guide humanity towards their ideal destiny. But Paul's own destiny is not so ideal, because no matter which path he chooses to take, which hypothetical button he presses, billions of deaths resulting from his actions seem inevitable, and he will carry the guilt and horror of each one. But this is the function Paul was born for, as the sandworm is destined to drown, as the Barley King is destined to... well, they do a lot to the poor guy. Paul is destined to bear the burden of unthinkable loss. Though he may appear to be wielding the knife, he is also very much on the sacrificial slab, a chosen one, only insofar as he was chosen to suffer. The idea of a chosen one, of a hero locked into a narrative by the forces of predestination, is typically presented as a fate more exciting than being a lamb to the slaughter. And yet, like Frazer's harvest deities, classical and modern chosen ones tend to be simultaneously exalted and a kind of utilitarian sacrifice. For once destiny comes knocking, the protagonist has no choice but to do as fate demands, and fate often demands violence and suffering. Dune's Paul Atreides has been described as a deconstruction of the Chosen One myth, and while I think that's true, for even more reasons we'll get to, he's hardly the only predestined hero making a decision with unthinkable casualties. Like, there were supposedly over 1 million people on the Death Star when Luke gave it the old 1-2, but Luke doesn't feel like a Paul-level executioner because that simply isn't where his story's emphasis lies. The kid clearly isn't burdened by the casual mass murder murder, he's having a grand old time. And I'm not making some tired Empire apologist argument that Luke was in the wrong for choosing to press that particular button. Within the story's framework, the evil fascist Death Egg had to go, but that's a lot of suffering for fate to place on the shoulders of one innocent farm boy. Soldiers are on the march, an empire on the rise. Someone has to carry the burden of resistance, and in an act of cosmic unfairness, that someone shall be this child. Here's your glowy stick of destiny. I hope you can wash the blood off your hands. Torment as a consequence of being a chosen figure is not a uniquely modern concept. Having a special destiny in, say, Greek mythology has never been a good thing, but as awareness of, and frankly boredom with, the preordained hero trope has grown, anguish as a consequence of being the narrative's favorite has become a borderline prerequisite. More than ever, we want our contemporary heroes to suffer, in part just for the demanded pathos of storytelling, but especially to balance the scales if the figure has some kind of extraordinary ability. Like modern barley kings, our most deific idols must be ground to pieces for the myth to function. If at the end of a superhero movie, the chosen figure is not bloody and battered, missing eyes or limbs, their costumes shredded, their armor dented, have you really watched a superhero movie? For a being that is larger than life, their sorrows too must be proportionally epic. To be a god is to lay on the altar. Our growing need for mighty figures to suffer is apparent in the subtle difference between Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings films versus Aragorn in the original books. At the start of Fellowship, Book Aragorn is not exactly struggling under the weight of his special destiny. Like, he has the elves fix his fancy sword before he even leaves Rivendell. The dude is beyond confident that he's ready to be Middle-earth's super ruler. It is a more classical way of framing kingship that fits the modern Beowulf style the books are going for. But for the film, Jackson and co. definitely made a shift to an Aragorn who is absolutely tormented about being Middle-earth's most special boy. It's a clever reframing, because we, the audience, still know he's got the stuff. We've seen how he opens doors. But in making a figure who agonizes about his own destiny, who constantly protests he isn't worthy,
I have never wanted it.
The filmmakers help convince us that Aragorn is worthy.
I'm not the Messiah!
And so when Aragorn gets his prophecy-fulfilled ending, we accept it because we all know he had to sacrifice his pound of flesh to get there. Of course, there's another representation of sacrificial suffering in The Lord of the Rings, a character who doesn't quite get the same fairy tale ending. While he chooses to carry the ring, Frodo is then basically thrown headfirst into Destiny's wood chipper, shouldering the sins of the world very literally around his neck, and like Paul from Dune, oh boy does he suffer from it, ultimately left so broken from being fate's chew toy that he is unable to find peace at the end of his journey. And yet, the powers that be in Middle-earth allowed Frodo to go through with this unbearable sacrifice. He's the animal over the copper bowl, the effigy burned to stave off winter. For the good of the entire world, this innocent, supposedly, had to suffer. Under what conditions would sacrificing an innocent life be acceptable? A lot of us would very reasonably say no conditions, but then again, a lot of us have never experienced something like Bronze Age crop instability. If the loss of a harvest meant the loss of everyone you know, any method of control, no matter how immoral, might seem like a worthwhile gamble. What's the life of, for starters, a sheep next to the lives of all your loved ones? But what if, post-sacrifice, the famine doesn't end? You tried the sheep thing, the gods clearly still aren't happy. Well, what's more precious than a farm animal's life? Though less commonly practiced than pop culture indicates, human sacrifice as a break glass in case of emergency fallback exists on the periphery of most ancient cultures. In the Greek legend of Iphigenia, King Agamemnon is en route to the Trojan War when he accidentally kills the sacred deer of the goddess Artemis. Faced with divine retribution for spilling a holy animal's blood, Agamemnon is offered an unconscionable path forward, to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, and therefore escape the goddess's wrath. This is admittedly not quite a Dune-level moral quandary. One definitely should not sacrifice a child as a get-out-of-jail-free card, but there are other iterations of this choice. where no path is conscionable. In the film The Killing of a Sacred Deer, nobody actually kills a sacred deer, and yet its parallels to the Iphigenia myth make this title strangely perfect. Like King Agamemnon, the film's lead character, Stephen, has accidentally taken an innocent life. In his retribution, his family is stricken with an inexplicable and fatal curse, one that can only be lifted if Stephen chooses to sacrifice one of them. In this version of the story, there is no way out that doesn't involve the death of at least one family member, no decision that could possibly be called ethical, and yet despite the torment, a decision must be made. How could a person, a society, possibly recover from having to make such a sacrifice? The answer historically seems to be make the victim on the altar into a kind of noble figure. In many versions of the myth, Iphigenia willingly goes to her fate, and Stephen's children are similarly pretty gung-ho about the whole thing. For if sacrifice is thought of as an inevitability, to be the one who sets things right through martyrdom is an opportunity to be, well, again, a sort of prophesied hero, if only for a brief moment. The tradition of being a noble figure and a sacrificial one have long been interlinked, with Fraser pointing in The Golden Bough to the historical example of Rex Nemorensis, or King of Nemi. This was a title held by a priest of the goddess Diana, the Roman equivalent of Artemis, and to honor their deity of the hunt, said priest would live in the wild by Lake Nemi where they could at any time be legally killed by someone who would then officially take their place as the next Rex Nemorensis. The king is dead. Long live the king. This idea of the chosen one being an official title passed posthumously from person to person as part of a long and tragic chain is a unique iteration on the horror of ordainment, one present in media like the Last Airbender series. In that world, to carry the title of Avatar is to be part of an endless cycle of death and rebirth, each new incarnation shouldering the conflicts the previous iteration failed to prevent, all while bearing the knowledge that they, too, could fall at any moment and have their failures pass on to the next in line. It's the chosen one with zero job security, and though some characters sympathize with the Avatar's burden, it's generally just accepted that this figure must fight and die for the greater good, even if said figure is a literal child. For if the world truly hangs in the balance, the loss of one innocent is easy to excuse. I remember struggling with Frodo's ending when I was younger. This idea that the character who sacrificed the most to save his home can't truly go back to it, that the weight they carried can never be removed. There are obvious historical parallels to Tolkien's experiences in World War I, where millions of young soldiers were fed to the sacrificial meat grinder of artillery warfare for a supposed higher purpose. And most soldiers who did return were of course not the same, with mental and physical scars from their experiences that ran so deep they would never truly heal. While Tolkien denied allegory in his own writing, people have long pointed out that his story about pastoral farmers drafted into a conflict against an industrial warmongering empire only to come home forever altered by the traumas endured seems to have at least a hint of autobiographical framing. But even taking him at his word that any overlap is coincidental, there are still meaningful parallels to be drawn between the casualties of history and the casualties of fiction. Again and again, in fact and mythology, truth and legend, innocents suffer to maintain a peace that they will never know themselves. There's a particular flavor of sacrifice, of the blameless assuming blame to create a better world that they themselves will never get to see, that feels even less fair than the other models. A minor example of this can be found in the ritual of the goat that departs, better known as the scapegoat, which was once a literal goat that cities of various cultures would symbolically attach their sins to before sending the poor animal out into the wild to die. Out of context, it seems vaguely comical. This goat has her sins now, we are innocent, it was all this goat's fault. Fraser's The Golden Bough talks about goat sacrifice traditions, although he strangely doesn't talk about the scapegoat ritual. And I feel I've gone as far as I can without mentioning that The Golden Bough is both a fascinating foundational text and also considered kind of a mess by modern anthropologists. But the scapegoat is unlike other animal rituals, as it's not symbolically innocent upon its death. Its reward for carrying sins like the One Ring out of the community is to be forever tainted. In making the village a place washed of wrongdoing, the scapegoat makes the village a place it can never return to. One of the more tragic scapegoat parables plays out in the Star Trek episode City on the Edge of Forever, where due to some truly wild time travel shenanigans, a woman named Edith Keeler living in the 1930s, who was supposed to die in a car accident, instead survives, and as consequence, the Axis powers win World War II, and the sinless future of the United Federation of Planets never materializes. Keeler herself has technically done nothing wrong. She is, by all measures, a saint who dreams of a better tomorrow, but because of the butterfly effect, all the wrongdoing of the world is unfairly pinned upon her back. And in a wildly dark twist, our intrepid heroes decide that Keeler has to die. At the other end of the scapegoat spectrum, an equally grim parable emerges in, no surprise, the Twilight Zone, where in the episode It's a Good Life, a child with inexplicable godlike powers is holding an entire town in agonizing captivity. And unlike your typical scapegoat, he seems the genuine nexus of all the community's wrongdoing. But he's also a child who does not fully understand the impact of his cruelty. Nonetheless, surely, such a center of evil cannot be allowed to live. One could frame Paul Atreides as existing somewhere on the scapegoat gradient, a figure who has the sins of the world thrust upon him, but who himself is fundamentally innocent, simply trying to do the best he can with only bad options. But such a framing is likely missing the greater whole that Frank Herbert intended. On some level, Paul has spent his whole life as a pawn, slid around the board by unseen hands, each move decided centuries prior. But on a deeper level, it's implied Paul has his own selfish motives for the particular future he chooses. He says there's no better path, but no better path for whom? He won't consider branches that will deny him vengeance against those who have wronged his family. He is on the altar. He is also holding the knife. Here again, a link emerges between Paul and worms. Not the sandworms this time, but literal worms. Earthworms are, in a sense, both innocent and guilty. On the one hand, the humble worm is the chosen one of soil health. Earthworm populations process 2 tons of dry matter per acre each year, helping make crops possible. If there is a god of the harvest that farmers should have been worshipping, it's the earthworm. On the other hand, there is an area where worms are genuinely destructive. Impossible as it might sound, earthworms are not native to the forests of Northern America, and their presence has massively limited maximum tree growth. Those impossibly tall old-growth trees will probably never get them back as long as the earthworms survive. But what should we do? Should we kill these sacred worms, decimate this innocent and beautiful population? Is that a worthwhile sacrifice? Could we ever be forgiven? To better illustrate the weight of an impossible decision, it's time for the interactive portion of this video. Just know that your pick will determine the fate of billions. Select the red or green button and watch the corresponding— wait, that's not how YouTube links work anymore. Okay, there should be an info card up there somewhere, although that might not work on mobile. Okay, links are in the description also. What a mess. Okay, I'm just gonna assume you chose one and watched it and came back. In which case, how did it feel? Do you think you made the right choice? Was there a right choice? Much further into the Dune series, the God Emperor of Dune, spoilers by the way, is a wholly human sandworm hybrid who rules over the galaxy. He is, in more ways than one, Paul's legacy, the ultimate sacred figure wielding unchecked violent power, and he's also the ultimate sacrifice. For the God Emperor of Dune has carefully and selflessly made himself into a scapegoat to be slaughtered, a villain that humanity will rally together to overcome like never before. It is the biggest, craziest, goofiest culmination of the series' main themes and the fundamental idea of a sacrificial god, the harvest deity to end all harvest deities. You kill the sacred worm, and thus humanity is saved. We as a species ultimately find it difficult to imagine a better world that isn't founded on the suffering of something. That's the argument Ursula K. Le Guin makes in her short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which imagines a utopian city of idealized happiness and prosperity, one so lovely that it's strangely hard to accept. Do you believe the story calls us out directly? Do you accept the city, the joy? No? And then, as if to help us out, the story imagines a child suffering in the bowels of the city, the dark secret that somehow powers this whole system. Many have said this is an allegory for our current system, how the world is built on haves and have-nots, how so much of what we own can only exist because of suffering laborers kept out of sight, and these are all salient points. But I also think Le Guin is poking fun, a little bit, at our lack of imagination. The idea across all our myths, our narratives, our societies, that something needs to be on the altar for spring to come again. When reading Omelas, it's almost a relief to find the sacrificial child beneath the city, because now at least the utopia feels attainable. But is that really the only path towards such a future? Must we kill the sacred worm? Hello. Keep doing what you're doing. What if you were watching this video 24 hours earlier? What if you were watching it alongside exclusive companion videos? Not just from me, but tons of other creators. I'm talking series, movies, podcasts, audio dramas, classes, cooking tutorials. And what if you were watching it all on a single platform? I mean, that would be a pretty good platform, especially if it all came packaged with extra fancy prestige originals from the channels you already love, the kind of premium stuff you cannot make on your typical YouTube budget. Well, the good news is, that platform exists. It's called Nebula, a creator-owned streaming service where not only can you access all my videos early and ad-free, but you can access tons of exclusive videos from myself and hundreds more channels, early and ad-free. The bad news is, well, there actually isn't any bad news, because you don't have to sacrifice a sacred worm to sign up for Nebula. All you have to do is follow my link, nebula.tv/curiousarchive, to get Nebula at 40% off an annual subscription, just $3 a month. By joining, you'll also get a front row seat to the aforementioned Nebula Originals, production quality videos and series. Lately, I've been watching War Room from Real Life Lore, a massive ongoing documentary show about evolving conflicts around the world, going into greater detail about what's happening globally and why than you'd frankly get from a Netflix documentary. It is so addictive. And if you want to share these videos with friends or family, every Nebula subscriber gets free guest passes as a way to give other inquiring minds access to everything on Nebula for a week. There are no restrictions on how much people can watch with these, they can just go nuts. Support me, support others, and support a better streaming service by signing up for Nebula today using the link on screen or in the description. It is one button you won't regret pressing. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this entry, please lend your support by liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon to stay up to date on all things curious. See you in the next video.